pleasure to meet all at last. And today, in terms of different franchises that have been long-lasting, franchises that have been ushering in a ton of different pop culture events, whether it be movies or shows, audiobooks, whatever you can possibly think of, let's just say that I do have a few more. And that cap again. Okay, well, we have ourselves number 2944. This, of course, we'll be talking a bit about Skylanders. Yeah, so in this case, we do have ourselves a certain video game series that's been going on for more than 15 years. And a couple of things I will point out right away is that even though Skylander started as far back as 2011, there's been a wild set of fan theories going along that states that at some point in the Spyro the Dragon franchise, considering the fact that Spyro the Dragon is one of the most popular characters in the series, the Skylanders games, of course, has many other characters to choose from. But in the case of Spyro the Dragon, a certain precedence had occurred with the Legend of Spyro trilogy going from 2006 to 2008. And supposedly, the very ending of The Legend of Spyro Dawn of the Dragon, 2008, had actually given us a supposed glimpse into said future on whether or not it would be, in fact, the precursor to Skylanders. And it does seem likely, now that I re-examine the whole thing, looking at the end of Dawn of the Dragon and looking at the beginning of some of the first installments in the Skylanders franchise, it's actually quite possible that Skylanders may or may not be a certain reboot sequel series to Spyro the Dragon, essentially expanding upon the idea that perhaps it just might be more of an expansion to the world-building nature of the Spyro games. The Legend of Spyro essentially not only built a world, but it sure did build a fresh new adventure for Spyro the Dragon. Also, having a highly acclaimed actors within the franchise was a pretty good call for the Legend of Spyro games. And I will say that Skylanders does seemingly chalk it up to a similar stature. Well, in any case though, the first thing to associate with is that Skylanders is in fact one of the first of its kind in the so-called Toys to Life video game series, that of which had practically exploded. I remember one of the first cases of Toys to Life, as this phenomenon was called, in which that action figures, collectibles, and etc. can be used for special content within the games themselves. One of the first that I came across was called Funkies. And I actually did own Funkies for some time on PC, and especially up until 2013, where some of the Funkies worlds and server systems would unfortunately stop running for some reason. And while I did continue to have my Funkies figures, as well as the official port platform that I would essentially hook up to my computer via USB cable, kind of sad to say that Funkies is kind of well below the dirt at this point. But you know what? Billiam actually made a whole video about Funkies at one point years ago, and I gotta say, he did prove to be just as enthusiastic about it as I was. I, of course, have talked about it before, but yeah, let's not get too off track here. Skylanders, while being the first, wasn't the first. It certainly was one of the first of its kind. And there would actually be many more to follow after Skylanders. There would be Nintendo's Amiibos, there would be Disney Infinity, and I also recall that there were a couple of others that would supposedly be placed upon from different franchises. So you could say that throughout the late 2000s and early 2010s, the Toys to Life set of video games, especially up until Lego Dimensions, would pretty much be a popular piece. But it does seem that after all these years, the addition of toys and collectibles being used for video games is kind of below standards nowadays. Considering the fact that most people want to purchase the video games themselves, and the video games themselves already have a bit of a hefty price tag, usually within $70, depending on which one you get. Though I have seen a lot of games be well within the $30 to $50 range, so By this point, it does seem that they are trying to be a little more on the economic side. So I don't know if Toys to Life is ever going to come through with it. Well, okay. I feel like I've gotten a little off track here. So, Skylanders, first of all, was put together by Toys for Bob and Activision, the same guys who were also responsible for Spyro and Crash Bandicoot. So these same guys that were publishing and developing these games for the PlayStation consoles would essentially take it upon themselves to expand from outside the PlayStation consoles, even going to the likes of Xbox, Nintendo, PC, mobile, etc. Skylanders was essentially the very big expansion point that these guys made. They truly expanded their operations, going well outside of PlayStation. Despite having had experience before, I'd say it was well within the Skylanders franchise that allowed for Toys for Bob and Activision to truly expand their territory and create a much more broader marketing campaign for a new generation of gamers coming to play anything Crash or Spyro related. And while there would be many more games throughout the 2010s, including some remasterings of Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon, there would also be kart racing games and a couple other things down the line as well. I especially do remember in the last several years that Crash Bandicoot especially has been getting some newer games, including an official Crash Bandicoot 4, and of course, an online multiplayer game in which Crash Bandicoot and company would basically compete against each other in a bunch of fun, unique gameplay. I will say, having played some of the more recent Crash games, it's a good way to at least get acclimated to what they can possibly achieve today. But at the same time though, it feels a bit cheap. Especially with the latest game, not necessarily giving us very much to work with here. Well, as far as the story goes, in terms of Skylanders, it first comes around into a realm of floating islands, which are referred to as the Skylands. And there is a group of heroes that work together to associate with the various elements, including air, light, fire, dark, earth, magic, etc. Essentially the elements of the earth. And with each element and each teammate and each member of the cast, we do have a variety of different things to work with here. A lot of content to expand upon. And it does seem that with every character that we collect for Skylanders, we get to unlock a variety of different things. And the games themselves, depending on which one you get, there sometimes will be different figurines and other collectible pieces that may be necessary to allow for the gameplay to be required here. So I feel like that's one of the main cons about the Skylanders games, as well as other games with the Toys to Life functionality. One of the main cons about this is that sometimes you can't quite make the games work very right unless you have the equipment necessary. And when you think about what I said earlier about games today being somewhat expensive, you can imagine the fact that 15 years ago, there were people that were buying the games for their console, and apparently the games told them that they needed special equipment and whatever just to make it work properly. While that's apparently not always the case here, it sure feels like it. Like somehow there's special things required just to make it function. You're probably familiar that a PlayStation Plus service sometimes is required for online multiplayer functionality, and I know some games that do require that, but I have of course been a subscriber of PlayStation Plus for years. So part of the reason why I do in fact intend on having it is not only to have full access to every game every which way, but I also do get free games every month. Not just as an inclusion by PlayStation Plus's random selection, in which up to 3 games are made possible for free each month, but because the plan I got means I have a whole list of free games to work with. And I will say, it's more than worth the price if you can get yourself a subscription like that. Usually within the $99 range, like I have, that's how it would work successfully. Well, anyways though, all the elements and characters that we work with here, in terms of all the games that have come around, some of the first games debuted as far back as 2011, and with most of the other games coming up as far more recent as 2016, I guess you could say it eventually drew to a close because the Toys to Life functionality just wasn't fitting in with everybody. Like I said, LEGO Dimensions came around and Disney Infinity came around. It seemed that after several years of the Toys to Life functionality first appearing with Funkies and other such things, they eventually had to draw to a close. Most likely because of mass complaints generated from having to purchase additional pieces just to make things work. And I can understand that some people out there might have been really frustrated with getting to be a part of a certain subculture because purchasing a certain game apparently made you the coolest kid on the block or something. But having to purchase a bunch of toys to go along with the games, it sometimes made you feel like it was defeating the whole purpose of having a game entirely. Or just the fact that specific requirements were made really downplayed and undermined the so-called value of having a person's growth be made by ways of social upgrades or otherwise. So when you think about how games are nowadays, life is simpler after all. We get to purchase games that are as cheap as $30, and most of the time when we do so, we feel like our money is way better spent in this regard. Because you definitely don't want to spend money on a game and then to spend additional assets just to gain additional functions and powers. I mean, isn't DLCs enough? And most of the time they're optional anyways, so we don't really need to purchase them unless we feel like we need to understand the full story and context within. Well, I feel like that's that. While I can't say very much about the story and plotline, I will at least admit, the kind of history and legacy this series has carried on so far, it seems kind of hard to imagine it ever coming back today, even if they were able to create a more modern version of Skylanders, essentially giving us the more appropriate look for the decade. And considering the fact that the video game industry is pretty much filled to the brim with upcoming releases and whatnot, the whole rest of the year 2026 is going to have a ton of new things waiting for us. So I guess with that said, thank you very much for watching this piece of HJN, and I will of course be back with more content very soon.